Hello and welcome to this special broadcast on One India. Well, what is happening in the vicinity of India is something that is concerning not just for India but for the whole world. And to discuss the matters further, how the atrocities on the Hindu communities, how the breaking down of the apparatus there is going on, how concerning it is. To discuss that further, we have Pramit Pal Chaudhary. He is head of India Practice Group, Eurasia Group, and foreign policy and political economy analyst. Pramit, thank you so much for speaking to One India.
Thank you.
Well, Pramit, how do you perceive the recent reports of Hindu communities being targeted in Bangladesh? Are these isolated incidents or do they indicate a broader pattern of religious intolerance?
So this seems to be working, at least as far as anybody can see, on two levels. One is targeted attacks led probably by Jamaat or other Islamic groups. There are a number of them functioning in Bangladesh. They have been always very clear of their opposition to or presence of non-Muslim religious minorities, not just Hindus, but Buddhists and Christians. And they have had long animosity towards the presence of minorities in the country, and have long made argument that Bangladesh should be a fully Islamic nation, both in terms of its population, its civil code should be Sharia-based, and this has not been nothing new in that sense. Obviously, Sheikh Hasina saw the Jamaat not just as ideological opponents, but also responsible for the death of her family, the murder of her family in 1975, has long had held them in check, in fact, had in many ways persecuted them. So there's definitely a set of attacks that have taken place that are based on this. We also, however, have attacks that were political in the sense that because of the nature of the politics of Bangladesh, the Awami League, Sheikh Hasina's party, always had very strong minority support. And so there was always a disproportionate number of members of the Awami League and Awami supporters who were Hindu, because obviously there was the only party that at least espoused a secular political philosophy. So there has been revenge attacks, if you wish, against Awami League supporters, partly because of the 300 dead people who were killed in the protests that led to her downfall, but also because she had an autocratic streak and she did persecute, arrest dissidents and opponents against her party. So some of the Awami League, so there have been attacks on Awami League supporters across the country, both Muslim and Hindu. So we have a bunch of attacks on Awami League supporters who happen to be Hindu rather than because of that. It's very hard to distinguish one from the other, however, given the present degree of confusion. But we do know that both such attacks have taken place.
Right. Pramit, if we take a look at one of the commonalities that is coming up is the creation of a list of Hindus to be attacked in Bangladesh. I mean, the people who are crossing the border, who are able to speak up and share their notions, are saying, this whole idea beat in 1971 also. That a particular dedicated, targeted killings were done in that respect, and the historical precedent of Nazis making lists of Jews during World War II, any parallel that can be drawn between the two?
Well, I mean, drawing up lists is not uncommon if you're trying to deliberately target a certain group. And this would not just be because of their religion, it could also be their ideology, even because of their wealth. I mean, organized social protests will often draw up lists. The reason why I would differentiate between the Nazis, Nazi Germany was designed eventually, the so-called final solution that Hitler propounded was the extermination of the entire Jewish population, that they would be literally killed off. In theory, Jamaat or other organizations argue that if you convert to Islam, then we don't have a problem with you anymore. or if you just leave the country, then you're not part of the Islamic Republic. Extermination is probably not something that they would espouse, but conversion, forcible conversion, or deportation would be perfectly acceptable. But obviously there's a degree of violence here, and they don't have a problem that if you resist these arguments, then they would be prepared to kill or otherwise do things to you. I think that the real case, of the most famous case of the list, really was in the 1971 war, where the Pakistani military drew up long lists of Bengali intellectuals, both Hindu and Muslim, political leaders, arrested and deliberately killed them off, literally by the tens of thousands, in the run up to what led to the 71 war between India and Pakistan, and the ultimate liberation of Bangladesh. That was probably the most egregious example and most extensive example of listing people for targeting purposes. And that was deliberately because the Pakistani military tried to eradicate the entire Bengali intellectual class of Bangladesh.
Right. Pramit, looking at it once again from the attacks point of view, there are voices that have echoed similar sentiments that back in 1971 too, when they were being attacked, the Hindu families, they were not asked or inquired about their caste. And as you also mentioned, that it was not the only basis on which they were being targeted. What does it reflect on the nature of the violence, and what does it imply about the attacker's motive in that scenario?
So you said that they were asking people what their caste, Hindus, what their caste was before they were attacked.
That was missing. That part was missing. Just because they were Hindus,
yeah,
matter whatever caste they were. Yeah.
Well, that wouldn't be a surprise, really, because it was not Hindu on Hindu violence. Only Hindus concerned themselves about caste issues and caste divisions. For Muslims, at least in Bangladesh, the caste would be irrelevant. It would be solely an issue about whether or not you were a Hindu or not. In many ways, you could argue there's long been a struggle in Bangladesh between its, should we say, Bengali identity and its Islamic identity, and which in many ways are two different identities. Nasrul Islam, the national poet of Bangladesh, was of course an important pillar of the so-called Bengal Renaissance, the literary and cultural leadership that produced people like Bankim Chandra or Rabindranath Tagore. But Nasrul Islam was interesting. He wrote poetry about Allah, about his Muslim faith. He also wrote poetries to Kali. He wrote poems to Kali because he saw her as the Bengali representation of Bengali culture and religion. But Bangladesh, even under Sheikh Hasina, has suppressed the fact that he wrote poems about Kali. So if you go to Bangladesh, their books and their texts and their statues and everything to Nasrul Islam, this is completely eradicated. And in fact, when he died, his widow decided to live in Calcutta, not in Dhaka, because, and she famously said, it is because in Calcutta, they recognized both the Islamic and the Bengali elements of his culture, that he was both a believer, a worshiper of both Allah and Kali. In Dhaka, they've eradicated the Kali part, right? So that's what I'm saying. There was a Bengali identity. It's still there in Bangladesh. It's still very strong, especially among the elite. Some of them will come to Calcutta, they go to Shantiniketan for education, they sing Rabindra Songit and so on. But there is also, and Jamaat, I think, is a representation of this idea that, no, we're Islamic more than we are anything else. And therefore, a lot of this Bengali element of it, which has obviously is partly syncretic, has a large Hindu element, should be suppressed. And that's a battle that has been going on arguably since 1947, if you want, definitely since 1971 in Bangladesh. Right now, I think with these present political developments, it is now tilted very strongly in favor of the Islamic identity element.
Right, Pramit. Indeed, I mean, the insights that you share are something that would not just jolt the common conscience, but also bring a lot of things into light, which primarily get hidden in the rush of the things. One final question, Pramit, before I let you go: what steps do you think the Indian government and the international community on the whole should take to address and mitigate the rising violence against the Hindus in Bangladesh as we speak? Is enough being done to protect the minority communities there?
So right now, it's mainly just about consciousness raising. India's
Mhm.
raised it, the European EU ambassadors raised it, the American State Department has expressed their concern. So we can see that there's that growing sort of international thing that you need to do something about this. The second element of it is administrative. One of the reasons it continues, it's now, I believe, reduced, it's hard to measure, is simply that there is no real government in place. The interim government does not have control of a large part of the country. It has already said that law and order is its first priority. So a simple example was that because so many policemen were lynched or killed or attacked,
Mhm.
uh, the police went on strike. They said, we're not going to work anymore. So net result is there are possibly still large portions of Bangladesh where there are no policemen working. So students took over some of that law and order, but it's not really possible for a small and disorganized student population to take over the law and order of an entire nation of 170 million people. I mean, Bangladesh has more people than Russia. So this obviously leads the way for antisocial elements or just anybody to go out and do what they feel like if they have the muscle power. So restoring order, having a stable government would be the second step. The
Mhm.
third step, I think, would then be once you actually have a government to work with, it's much easier to apply pressure or persuade them to take action. Bangladesh, so I would expect, from my
Mhm.
understanding, looking at the in nature of the interim government that has come to power, that has been processed, other than one Islamic scholar, and he does come from an extreme Islamic party, all of the others and there's even one of them is a Hindu
Mhm.
in the government. This is not a group that is in any way interested in promoting an Islamic agenda and would, in fact, take it seriously that minorities are being attacked inside the country,
Mhm.
and would like to take action on that front. The military themselves are actually quite strongly opposed to Jamaat and Islamic groups or radical Islamic groups in the country.
Mhm.
So then you have somebody to work with, and I think they would probably react reasonably strongly. In an extreme situation, I think not so much with an interim government, but
Mhm.
when they hold elections and bring back an elected government,
Mhm.
there's a reasonably good chance that the next government would be led by the opposition
Mhm.
and could be a coalition between the Bangladesh National Party, the BNP,
Right.
and the Jamaat. If
Oh.
the Jamaat then insists on using the fact that they control the instruments of power to carry out attacks and so on, then India and the rest of the world can consider a number of issues, but one of them is very important to realize.
Mhm.
Bangladesh's single engine of their economy is the exports of garments, and they are
Government.
exported mainly to
Textile.
the European Union, to the
True.
United States, and about $1.2 billion to India. You cut that off or you restrict it, Bangladesh's economy goes into free fall. And that's an extreme posture because that would breed instability, which India wouldn't be interested in, but it is something that could conceivably be considered if Bangladesh were to go out of control.
Right. Pramit Pal Chaudhary there, head of India Practice Eurasia Group and Foreign Policy and Political Economy Analyst. Pramit, thank you so much for speaking to One India.
Thank you.